Okay, welcome back. So today we're going to talk about Neolithic and Megalithic art. Now I realized when I gave the last lecture I didn't stop to talk a little bit about dates, and so I probably should. So I actually added a couple of slides to this lecture. So if you don't see these on the PDF, don't worry, I will update the PDF so these are there. I felt like we ought to talk a little bit about dating terminology, because not everybody knows what these terms mean. So when we talk about the Stone Age, what we're talking about, of course, is a level of technology. We call it the Stone Age because the principal technology that people used was stone tools, such as these Acheulean hand axes. And we break the Stone Age up into three big categories. The Old Stone Age, which is the Paleolithic, and that starts at around 2.5 million years BP. And BP is just a term we use to mean before present. So it's kind of a relative term. The most significant period of the Paleolithic is the Upper Paleolithic. This is the very tail end of the Paleolithic, and it's about circa, and that's what circa means. It means about, in case you were wondering. Every time you see that little C with a period behind it, that means circa, or about. 50,000 years before the present. So this is the era of the Ice Age technological revolution with their needles, scrapers, bifacial blades, harpoons, etc. This is also the era of cave art. Then we have the Mesolithic, which is the Middle Stone Age, and it starts again circa 20,000 years before the present. And it's kind of the smallest era. It's this transition era before we get to the New Stone Age, the Neolithic. No one ever said that archaeologists suffered from an overabundance of imagination. These terminologies. And the Neolithic is generally regarded to begin somewhere around circa, again, 12,000 years before the Common Era. Now, that's BCE. And what does BCE? Well, it means before the Common Era, and the Common Era is just before year zero. And so on the traditional Christian calendar, we start with the year zero, and that's supposedly the year that Christ was born, but the truth is that it's actually not. We know that Jesus Christ was born somewhere around the year 4 to 7 BC. Why? Because they actually got it wrong. When they started dating from the birth of Christ, somebody added up all the dates wrong, and so we actually know that year zero isn't the birth of Christ. It's actually quite a few years after the birth of Christ, so it's kind of arbitrary. This is exactly identical to BC. So if you've ever seen BC and you start to see BCE, it means exactly the same thing. But instead of saying before Christ, it's before the Common Era. Why do we do this? Well, for one, the date isn't accurate anyway. Year zero is a few years after the birth of Christ. But the other reason is we're talking about a lot of cultures that aren't necessarily Christian. And so for the sake of sensitivity, we don't want to use a term that is exclusive to Christian civilization. We want to be more inclusive than that. So that's what that means. And so you'll also see the antecedent to that, which is if you have before the Common Era, you have Common Era. And so Common Era is everything after the year zero. And the New Stone Age is a period where we have the invention of a lot of fiber arts, ceramics, the bow and arrow, but of course the two big ones are going to be animal domestication and agriculture. Now, I do want to stress that when we're talking about this kind of terminology, it's always important to know that these are relative terms, that they're dependent on technological developments, not absolute dates. What does that mean? Well, that means that just because one culture is in the Neolithic period, it doesn't mean that all cultures are in the Neolithic period at the same time. Almost all cultures started at a Stone Age with stone technology, but some evolved very quickly and developed things like bronze and iron, and others didn't. And so different cultures reach technological development at different paces. And so this sometimes creates some interesting incongruities, let's put it that way. For example, Stonehenge. Stonehenge is this monument that was made during the Neolithic period in what is now the British Isles. But it's actually built contemporaneous to the Great Pyramids at Giza. So both the Neolithic Stonehenge and the Bronze Age pyramids were built in the middle of the 3rd millennium BCE, which is funny. But one is a Bronze Age monument and the other is a Neolithic monument, even though they're built at exactly the same time. Why? Because the people in the British Isles hadn't discovered bronze yet. They were on the verge of discovering bronze, but hadn't quite got there. And so they were still a Stone Age culture. And truthfully, there are still some cultures on the planet today that are functionally Stone Age cultures. You may have heard of the Bushmen of the Kalahari down in Africa, who right up until the 20th century were living pretty much a Stone Age culture, while the rest of us had moved past the Industrial Revolution and into the Information Age. So it's always important to remember these things are relative dates. They're never ever hard and fast dates. And some cultures are out of the Neolithic really quick. The cultures of Mesopotamia and Egypt get out of the Stone Age really quick, whereas for most of Europe and the rest of the world, they linger on in the Stone Age for quite a long while. All right, so we're going to start this in an interesting place. We're actually going to start this in a place that you don't think of as a place full of life and innovation, and that's going to be the Sahara Desert right down here. Now, as you look at this on the satellite map, you can tell it's a pretty bleak space. And again, Utah is a lush paradise compared to this. It is an absolute desert, but it wasn't always a desert. In fact, a little over 10,000 years ago, it was a lush veldt. It was a savanna with lots of grasslands, and lots of people lived there. And not just people, but animals. And we know this because they carved pictures of those animals into the rock. So this is in the middle of a very bleak desert in the middle of Nigeria, the Tenere Desert. But here you can clearly see 2 giraffes that have been carved into the rock. There are no giraffes living in this region today. It's far too dry, but they lived there at the time. And so this was actually a very nice place to live. And it's here where we have all of this rock art carved into the rock or painted onto the rock surfaces, and it actually records their history. So we get a sense of these developments, these Neolithic developments. Again, Neolithic is a technological term. It's when did a culture pass a certain level. And what we see is at the end of the Ice Age, around 9000 BCE, when the Sahara Desert is still a kind of lush grassland, we see people moving from hunter-gatherers to pastoralism. What do we mean by that? A hunter-gatherer is someone who everything that they eat has to be either gathered from the wild or killed, hunted, and there is no other means of food production. But pretty quickly in the Neolithic, and beginning in the Mesolithic actually, in the Mesolithic we first domesticated dogs, or they domesticated us, that's still a debate, but we figured out how to domesticate animals, and that's really great. Because it means you don't have to kill the animal to sustain yourself. You could keep the animal alive and you can milk it, and you can eat the milk, you can herd the animal, you can direct it. So now, instead of having to hunt your food source, you can take your food source around with you. And around this time period, people move to pastoralism. And pastoralism is herding. It's moving animals around. Now, they're still not growing their own food, they're raising their own animals, so they have to move the animals around the grassland, because otherwise they would overgraze an area. So these people are nomadic, they move around, and we see these people develop in North Africa and the ancient Near East. And this means that they now have a food surplus. If you're not constantly hunting, you now have more time to devote to developing a rich material culture. And I want to stress this point. Nothing in the world happens without a surplus. You know, if you're a hunter-gatherer, you're basically going from hand to mouth. And if you don't have any extra food stores, and it's very hard to store food if you're a hunter-gatherer, because it rots so quick, you basically don't have the time to develop things like a bow and arrow or fiber arts, baskets, nets, or anything else. So a food surplus means that people can specialize in labor. It means that they can actually move forward and develop new trades, new professions. Maybe you're not the best hunter, and so now you can dedicate your time to something like basket weaving. And that means that now people can diversify, and if this person's really good at doing baskets and you're really good at hunting, then you can trade. This is the laws of comparative advantage if you're interested in such obscure economic terms. But it really means we see an increase in the material culture. Not surprisingly, we see an increase in art as well. And you can see this. These beautiful panels that come from Algeria in North Africa from this time period. And here you can see they have, I'm just going to highlight some of these little corrals to corral animals. You can see that they're herding and lining animals up. You can see that they're herding the animals. And here we have goats and cattle. It's really kind of neat. So looking at our timeline, the Ice Age is slowly coming to an end by about the year 9000 or so. And the hunters and gatherers that had dominated start to disappear. There's always going to be pockets of hunters-gatherers somewhere. And we start to see this development. And we see that they move away from the spear throwers to bows and arrows, which are a lot more efficient. And we can see that the art becomes a lot more developed too. Look at how naturalistic and beautiful these are. And also look how well proportioned the humans are. And look at how he depicts the calves or the elegant kind of limbs of the bow. It's really quite lovely. The largest pocket of this rock art that we can find is in Tassili, Niger, which is in Algeria. It's right in the middle of this bleak Sahara desert. I mean, it really is bleak. Take a look at that. There's hardly any vegetation at all. It looks like Hanksville, Utah. If I have any students from Hanksville, Utah, no offense, but when they went to go practice the lunar rovers for the Apollo program, they took them to Hanksville, Utah, because it was almost like the moon. It's really bleak. So now imagine a whole region like that. That's what it's like. But it wasn't like that 9,000, 10,000 years ago. 9,000, 10,000 years ago, it was actually quite lush. And you can see that in the rock art. In the rock art, we see people that seem to be spreading nets, herding animals using bows and arrows. We see depictions of boats. We see people in a variety of clothing, these wonderfully depicted figures, figures engaged in some kind of either activity or making things. And we see all varieties of these. We see enclosures for animals or houses, cows, and these really wonderful, beautiful, organic forms to the figures. We see the development of the bow and people using the bow, etc. So these are really quite beautiful, and part of the reason we have this beautiful, rock art. This isn't in caves; these are just rock shelters. These are just overhangs, open overhangs, very similar to what we have across the American Southwest in rock art. Excuse me, coughed into the elbow, just so you know. And this is largely, again, because we have a surplus, because the food allows people to live this way. Well, now we're going to move to the Near East. So we move away from North Africa and the Sahara Desert, and we're going to be moving into this region, the Middle East. And an awful lot of the activity that we're going to talk about from here on, either in the Neolithic or in the Bronze Age, is going to be happening in this region. And there's two major regions we're going to be talking about. One is Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia is a Greek word that literally means between the two rivers. And you can see the two rivers here. There's one, and there's the other. And they snake down to the Persian Gulf. This is the Tigris and the Euphrates. And so you have all of these high mountains up here, and they draw water down through this desert. So even though this is a abject desert, this is the modern state of Iraq. This is Kuwait down here. but this is the modern state of Iraq, even though it's very, very dry, this ends up being a very lush place to grow food because you have water and because you can irrigate. The same thing is true of the Levant. The Levant is the coast of the Eastern Mediterranean that includes Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, and Syria, and then Turkey up here. We'll also be talking about Turkey a bunch too. And so it's in this region that we have what's known as the agricultural revolution. So we talked about the technological revolution was one of the first revolutions. The agricultural revolution is the next. And it takes an enormously long period of time. And it happens in fits and spurts. People realize that, moving animals around, you're kind of at the mercy of whether there's plants or not. And if there are plants for the animals to graze on, you're good. But if there's not, your animals quickly starve, and then if your animals starve, you starve. So they start figuring out how to replant plants. They actually burn grasslands and knock the heads of tall grasses down to spread seed and propagate seed so that animals will have more grass. And then eventually they figure out how to collect these seeds and grind them into flour to make bread. And so we have the development of agrarian societies in the Levant and the Near East. And this is really made possible because of irrigation, that they can take rivers and they can build channels that will take water to fields. These fields, they can use animals to plow the fields, and this will allow them to grow a food source. Now, the biggest thing that this does is it allows you to settle down. You don't have to settle down. You don't have to wander around, with your animals. You can grow your own food. You're still at the mercy of a drought, but it's a lot more dependable than even animal domestication. And this allows you to build permanent villages and permanent buildings for the first time because you don't have to move around. And we see a huge explosion in material culture. And we break the Neolithic into periods based on, again, these technological developments. One of the things they develop is ceramics, and we break the Neolithic into the pre-pottery Neolithic, the PPN, which happens about before 6000 BCE, and the pottery Neolithic, which is PN. And that's also broken down into the various different stages, and that's about after 6000 BC. And so around 6000 BC, we start to see ceramic pots. Now, people had been modeling things in clay for a long time, but just for the fun of it and just for making, kind of little figures like those bison. But they started to figure out that if you work the clay, you work all of the air bubbles out of it and put it in a fire or a kiln, you can actually harden it. This is not an easy thing to figure out. It obviously took centuries for them to work out all the details. If you failed to knead all of the air bubbles out of your clay and you put that in a kiln, then your project could end up exploding and wiping out all of the other projects of, Ceramics 101 course. And I just speaking in a hypothetical sense. And then maybe you get depressed and go into something like art history instead. Moving on. So it's actually quite hard to figure this out, to actually make ceramics and to decorate ceramics. We also see an increase in fiber arts. They're not just doing baskets and sandals, they start weaving cloth. Cloth from the wool of the animals that they use and also from other sources, linen and cotton. We also see the first metalworking. We sometimes call the tail end of the Neolithic period the Chalcolithic, and Chalco just means copper. That they start working copper into ornaments and simple tools. So this was the prevailing, understanding of the world that we had. And again, this is another one of those things. When I was an undergrad and I was in school, this is how we were taught, that we had the age of the hunters and gatherers. At the same time, we have the development of farmers. This allows for permanent buildings and defenses in places like Jericho and Çatalhöyük, and that we weren't going to find any big monuments or significant monuments before this. Nope, that was it. We were done. You can't build big monuments like this unless you have agriculture, because you need the food surplus to make it happen. And then the dumb archaeologists kept digging. And they found a little place called Gobekli Tepe, which turned everything upside down. So let's talk about Gobekli Tepe and why it's so significant. Gobekli Tepe is a Turkish word, and it just means pot-bellied hill. It's a tiny little hill in the southeastern district of Turkey. So here's the eastern Mediterranean. This is Levant. These are the Tigris and Euphrates rivers that goes down through Iraq. This is Syria. So it's close to the border of Syria. I have a little video that will hopefully show you where this is. And hopefully it'll zoom down in on this so you can take a look at it. So this was a site that wasn't considered terribly significant. In the 1960s, an archaeological survey went and looked at this hill, and they concluded that this was a medieval graveyard and there was nothing else there. But in the early 1990s, a German archaeologist by the name of Klaus Schmidt actually went and took a look at this nondescript hill, and he dug into it, and he found absolutely amazing structures. A series of circular structures, and in those circular structures were large T-shaped monoliths, just gigantic things, some of them weighing up to 15 tons. Here's another view of this. These were surrounded by stone walls. Here's another view of these T-shaped monoliths. So this was quite surprising. This was not something that anybody was expecting. And he knew right away that this wasn't a medieval graveyard. He knew right away this had to be something far more significant. And so he started excavating it, and not only were the T-shaped monoliths impressive, but they were covered in really beautiful relief carvings. When he started looking at the relief carvings, he noticed that almost all of the animals on these relief carvings were wild animals: boars, scorpions, vultures. There was not a single thing that was a domesticated animal, which was interesting. Here's a picture of Klaus Schmidt standing next to one of his discoveries. Here are a couple more of some of these T-shaped monoliths. You can see that it has vultures, scorpions, a wild boar. This one has a leopard carved into it. And he started digging around. Whenever somebody makes something this big, you assume they're going to have a trash pit nearby. And he was a very good archaeologist from the Deutsche Archaeologisches Institut, so he went and dug up the trash pits. Archaeology, it's so glamorous, digging up thousands of years old trash. But it turns out that trash is very informative because it can tell you what the people ate and what their lifestyle was like. And he noticed something very strange. He was expecting to find the bones of sheep and goats because he assumed this was a Neolithic site, and he was putting it somewhere around 5,000, 6,000 BC. The reason he was putting it there is because there was no pottery, so it probably was right before, so it was the pre-pottery Neolithic. But he discovered something else, that the bones that he was looking at, all of the bones were from things like gazelles and antelope. There was not a single domesticated animal. They were all wild animals. And his first thought was, well, maybe they're building a site where there's a ritual, and part of the ritual is that you eat wild animals. And so that maybe the goats or the sheep would be someplace else. But he looked and he looked and he couldn't find anything. And it suddenly began to dawn on him that this was a place that was built not just before pottery, but that it was built before agriculture, and that it may have been built before the advent of even animal domestication. That's just kind of shocking. He was arguing that this was being built by hunters and gatherers. I want to stress why that's so important. That's why I had that conversation about agriculture. Nothing in the world happens without surplus. So if you're a bunch of hunter and gatherers, you have to spend a lot of time hunting and gathering. But when you look at the sophistication of these monoliths, when you look at the scale of it. This is not something that you could do with you and a couple friends in an afternoon in between hunts. This was something that you would have to organize hundreds or possibly thousands of people over a very long time. And to make these incredible enclosures, what many people now are calling the First Temple, and pushing these monoliths into position, you would have had to have had rollers and ropes and teams of dozens of men. You would have had to have skilled artists. And that doesn't happen overnight. You have to have a generation after generation of people learning how to carve things, learning how to carve the gates and set stones, or learning how to make these huge monoliths. You have to teach your children how to do this, and people have to specialize in doing this. This is not something you can just pull off on a whim. And that strongly suggests that if that's the case, that they had diversification of labor, they had complex social stratification, that they had societies numbering in the hundreds and possibly the thousands. Up until this point, we had thought that pre-agricultural people, hunters and gatherers in the Neolithic, just weren't up to this, that they just weren't sophisticated enough, that maybe they lived in small tribes of, 20 to 30, or at the most 60 to 80 people, just basically an extended family. And this shattered all of those notions. This just absolutely shattered it. And so he wanted to confirm this, so he actually did what every good scientist should do. He took the bone samples and he split them into 4 equal parts, and he sent them to 4 different labs. Didn't tell them where they came from, just said, give me a date on these. And they carbon dated them. Now, carbon dating is a little bit complicated, but everything that you eat is slightly radioactive. I hope you're aware of that. If you had a banana this morning, you are now more radioactive than the person who didn't have a banana. That's because there's these wonderful things called radioactive isotopes. Radioactive isotopes are regular old atoms, like carbon or potassium or whatever, but they happen to have an extra neutron or 2, and that makes them just slightly radioactive. The thing about radioactive isotopes is that they decay. They slowly give off particles, gamma rays or beta rays, until they become stable. So carbon-14 is the important one. Carbon-14 has a couple little extra nuggets in its nucleus, and as it decays, it eventually decays down to stable, good old carbon-12, which is not radioactive and doesn't decay. The rate of this decay is incredibly regular. It is like a clock. In fact, they can actually make clocks based on radioactive decay. It's atomic clocks. They're very accurate. Now, the thing about animals is that, and creatures and us, is that we continue to ingest small traces of this radioactive carbon-14 for our entire lives. And then when you die, you stop ingesting it, because dead things don't eat anymore, unless you're a zombie. And I don't think there were any zombie antelope or gazelles living in Turkey at the time. So that means that with no new radioactive isotopes coming in, the bones begin to decay, and as they decay, they give off a little bit of extra radiation. And so you can look at a bone and you can measure exactly how much carbon-14 is in it. And because carbon-14 decays at a very set rate, what we call its half-life, you can tell exactly how old it is. Now, there's some variation. Some areas of the world have a little bit more carbon-14 than other places, but you can usually get it down within a few hundred years. Sometimes you can get it down within like 50 or 25 years if you have a good enough sample. And every one of these labs dated these bones to somewhere around 10,000 to 11,500 BCE. And that's just remarkable. That's long before the advent of agriculture, and all the evidence suggests that the people who were doing this, who were building these wonderful T-shaped monoliths, who were carving these incredible reliefs, some of the first sculptures in the round, this sculpture here of a human being, maybe the first ever sculpture in the round of a human being. This really beautiful leopard who's been carved on the face of one of these T-shaped monoliths. All of this was being done by hunter-gatherers. And this upturns the apple cart to a great degree. How do hunters and gatherers have the food resources in order to pull this off? And we really don't know the answer to that question. Our best guess is that they may have been practicing something like quasi-domestication. This is something that Native Americans and Amerindians all over North and South America practiced. That is, instead of domesticating the animal, you domesticate the environment. If you kill all the predators in an environment and you burn the prairie, that propagates more grasses, so you suddenly have an overpopulation of deer or antelope, and so you have plenty of animals to hunt. And they may have done something like this. And this allowed them to feed the work crews who were clearly dedicated to building these amazing structures that we see here. This incredible art. So, but this begs the question that what is it that actually makes culture tick? And what we discovered is that our thinking prior to this was that you had to have agriculture. Agriculture gave you a food base. This is what caused you to have large societies, big stratified societies with a chieftain at the top, and etc. And it now turns out that that may be exactly the opposite, that the social stratification, the structure came first, and that it was only when these people became populous enough that they were pushing their environment to its limits. You can only imagine, they must have had hundreds of hunters scouring the countryside to kill enough gazelles and antelope to feed the people building this thing. You can only imagine, but they were really probably pushing their environment to the limit, and it's only after they had become so complex, so incredibly socially organized, so incredibly skilled, building truly monumental structures at Gobekli Tepe, that only then did they actually then figure out agriculture. So that really is surprising. It suggests that the cultural things precede the technological things, that we developed social stratification and societies long before. Now, that's probably pretty smart. It makes sense, because when you think about large societies, if you're talking about a small tribe of 60 to 80 people, you're probably related to everybody in that tribe. And the head of the tribe, the elder or chief of the tribe, is probably something like your grandfather or your great uncle. It's somebody that you know, and you can trust them because you're all family. But as societies get into the hundreds and the thousands, the guy who's leading the tribe is not going to be a relation. He's not going to be your grandfather or a great uncle. He's going to be somebody that you're no relation to at all. And the question becomes, how can you trust him to lead your society? And the answer is religion. That religion is the glue that holds society together, and it's the thing that inspires them to come together to build magnificent structures like this. In fact, there's a little bit of evidence here that that's what this is. It's a temple. If you look at the T-shaped monoliths, you'll notice that they have hands. You can actually see these hands wrapping around the front of the monoliths. These are meant to represent people. They represent them very abstractly, but they meant to represent people. They also have little loincloths down the front, which is kind of interesting. This one has a belt and a little loincloth. That strongly suggests that maybe these are ancestors, or perhaps gods, and that it is the appeasing of these ancestors or gods that really is what brought people together, that allowed them to organize, and that the organization comes first. That once the organization happens, then, and only then, can people do things like build irrigation and work together to achieve the kind of societies that we're looking into. But it's still an abject marvel. First of all, it's a miracle that we discovered this place. And I really want to stress how big this is. So if we imagine a timeline with the remote past into the tail end of the Mesolithic or the Neolithic, and if you imagine the other line on the other side, the present. So Gobekli Tepe is built somewhere around 11,500 to 10,000 BC. Jericho is built maybe around 9,000 BCE. Çatalhöyük, one of our first Neolithic villages, is built around 6,000 BCE. Sumer and the invention of writing and the first true civilization is around 3,400 BCE. The pyramids are around 2,500. Stonehenge is a little bit after that. And then around the year 7 to 4 BCE is the birth of Christ. And then everything else after that is right up into the present time. So if you think about this, the time span from us right today to the foundation of human history in the year 3,400 or so is about, 5,400 years. So this thing is farther from the beginning of civilization than we are. Okay, it's easily thousands of years older, further away from the foundations of Ur and Uruk and Sumeria, the first true civilizations, than we are. That's incredibly ancient. And of course, it also opens up this enormous problem. This is kind of like finding a steam engine in the Middle Ages. It shouldn't be there. In fact, every scientist, every archaeologist, anthropologist pretty much declared that this was impossible, but there it is. And finding such sophisticated stuff before the advent of agriculture suggests that humans are a lot more clever and a lot more capable than we ever gave them credit for. And so it begs the question, that's why that red question mark is there, what else are we missing? If we could miss Gobekli Tepe, if we could just, miss this, then there's certainly a lot more out there that we don't even know about, and we can't even begin to fathom. I'm not going to go into ancient astronauts or, territory. I think that's ridiculous. But it is true that there's a lot more out there than we ever could have guessed. This was called in the press as the first temple, but the one thing I can tell you for certain is it's not the first temple. This thing is too sophisticated to have been the first temple. There must have been some developmental stages to this point. This is easily the 40th or 50th temple, and there's probably earlier temples out there, maybe hundreds of earlier temples. Then project this a little bit further. So think about the timeline going all the way back to Gobekli Tepe, then think about the timeline going back to the Venus of Willendorf and one of the earliest cave arts, Chauvet Cave. There could be so much back there we don't understand and have no knowledge of. It's really, really quite incredible. So Gobekli Tepe is rewriting the textbooks. It's not in most of the modern textbooks, frankly. When I started teaching about it about 10 years ago, none of the textbooks had it. Now they're starting to catch up for good reason. It really is a phenomenal site and rewrites our understanding of human history, both what humans have done and what they're capable of doing. But for most of the history of the Neolithic, it's really going to be agricultural developments first. And so everywhere else we see the development of agriculture. So you can understand why we didn't expect something like Gobekli Tepe. Another site in Turkey that's very famous, which is where all the textbooks on Neolithic began when I was a student, is a place called Çatalhöyük. Çatalhöyük is a little city, and you can see it. It's right there in central Anatolia. So Gobekli Tepe is over here, so it's right in the neighborhood, a couple hundred miles away, but still. And it was one of the earliest agrarian communities. There's not much there today to look at, just some low mud brick walls. Again, mud brick, when I taught in Pennsylvania, nobody believed you could build things out of mud brick. And then I taught in Texas, in far west Texas, where people were still building in mud brick. It's really quite amazing. and they were, still constructing things in mud brick.